Our scripture passage continues to be in Luke chapter 6 as we kind of following the lectionary right now. So as I've said to you before, please talk to your other Presbyterian Episcopal friends, and we'll see how they do with their sermon today with this passage. Another difficult one from Luke, from what Luke called the Sermon on the Plain, from chapter 6, beginning with verse 27. Jesus is speaking. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put onto your lap, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Like it or not, this is God's holy word. May God bless it for our hearing and understanding. Amen. In Say You're One of Them, a collection of short stories by U.M. Akpan, a Nigerian author and a Catholic priest. Every tale in this series of short stories is pivoted by a plot of hate between tribes or religious nations, Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, civil war in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Each of these African stories are all about hatred of one person towards another simply because the other person was a part of a group of people that were different from the person in the story. These tragic tales in this collection, however, offer nothing new. This story is as old as human history. From Nazis and Jews, English settlers and Native Americans, Chinese and Japanese during World War II, world history is littered with terrible wars and atrocities between one set of people upon another set of people. If you go back in history, you find the same is true as you turn the pages of centuries. The French and the Germans used to hate each other. During the time of the Crusades, Christians who invaded the Middle East did so in part because of their hatred for the Muslims. The Romans hated the barbarians who eventually conquered Rome. Jews and Samaritans in Jesus' day would not even sit down at a table to eat together. Scratch the surface of the Bible or history or best-selling novels, And you will see stories of people who are different from each other and how they don't like those people. Tribalism is a disease that has infected humankind dating back to cave-dwelling days. In our own country, feelings about people who are different from us, whoever us is about tensions in our own society. Christians often look at Muslims as potential terrorists until they can prove their good character. Hard feelings about immigrants run high, especially against Latin American communities. For 2,000 years, Jesus has been telling his disciples to love their enemies, to love those who persecute you, to do to others as you would like them to do to you. He's got to be really disappointed, right? I mean, how much better are we today at loving our enemies than when he was saying these words 2,000 years ago? For every advance that we have made in civil rights or in ending apartheid in South Africa, there was a Hamas attack on Israel and the corresponding Israeli devastating war on Gaza. It's easy or easier to love family and friends. But Jesus scoffs. Isn't that what he's saying? He's scoffing at making anything about that. What credit is that to you if you love those who love you? Even sinful people do that. But love your enemies, he says. Do good, lend, expecting nothing in return. When human nature seems wired for this disease of tribalism, us and them, how are we as followers of Jesus supposed to break this cycle and to love our enemies? For the second week in a row, we are reading into Luke's Sermon on the Plain, which has its parallels in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Both authors copying a common source, an unknown source that biblical scholars have for over a century called Q. Both gospel writers place this teaching, love for your enemies, as part of Jesus' core teaching. I tell young people, teenagers all the time, if you want to know what Jesus really teaches, just focus on Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus' greatest hits. It's part of his core teaching. In Luke, it's just a Sermon on the Plain in chapter 6. In Matthew, he introduces this section this way. He says, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. Matthew sees this teaching as one of the things that distinguishes followers of Jesus from civil religion, respectable religion. Civil religion is about taking care of ourselves, looking out for your neighbors, upholding the values of society, teaching our children right from wrong, maintaining the status quo. All of that is well and good. But Matthew thinks that to be a follower of Jesus, our faith calls us to go beyond the values of society, to go beyond the values of civil religion, the religion of self-interest. Luke jumps straight from his Beatitudes into this teaching about loving your neighbor. The last of Luke's Beatitudes, blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, when they revile you, when they defame you. And then Jesus says, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Do you see those connection between that beatitude, the last beatitude in Luke, which is also the last of the beatitudes of Matthew, the connection between those beatitudes and this loving your enemies? Blessed are you when people hate you. Therefore, do good to those who hate you. Blessed are you when people revile you. Therefore, pray for those who abuse you. Blessed are you when people defame you. Therefore, bless those who curse you. While Matthew and Luke package Jesus' teachings, love your enemies, differently, when it comes to the actual commands, the actual guidance Jesus offers, they are remarkably consistent given the way they oftentimes see things differently. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other also. If they take your coat, give them your shirt. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Here Jesus dismisses transactional morality. Quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Jesus dismisses this. Luke has one more line in his statements that plainly explains this transactional thinking, this transactional accounting. If you lend to others to hope receive back, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to others to receive back, and maybe with interest. Here, Matthew and Luke agree about what Jesus said, to love your neighbor, the person who is like you. Anybody can do that. In fact, most people do that. The question is, how big is their circle of neighbor? That's the difference. If it's just your family, or your coworker, or your partner in crime, that's a small circle. Jesus wants us to expand that circle. To be a follower of Jesus, we are required to love our enemies. To love your enemies, Jesus says, means that we will become like the children of the Most High. For God is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked. Sometimes we wish he wasn't. Well, that's all well and good, maybe even inspirational. But just how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to love those that we don't even like? "20 years ago, Laura Blumenfeld wrote a book titled Revenge, subtitled A Story of Hope. I was fascinated by that juxtaposition, revenge, a story of hope. Her father, an American Jew, was shot in the old city of Jerusalem by a Palestinian terrorist. A decade later, not the next day, a decade later, she went looking for him. Today, with Gaza's near total destruction at the hands of Israel's revenge for the barbaric attack by Hamas on October 7th, 2023, her book feels especially important. How could someone be so callous as to walk up to a complete stranger, a tourist just visiting some of the ancient sites of old Jerusalem, and shoot him in the head? What kind of person could do that? Blumenfeld couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel and heartless and to attack her father that way. She was and is a journalist, and so she decided to find out using her journalistic passion and her skills. And her journey took her into a good example of what it might mean to love our enemies. One of the first things, when to be clear with all this, is that Jesus did not say, like your enemies. People generally have enemies in one or two ways. One, either someone personally, directly hurt you, abused you in some way, physically, emotionally, financially, and you hate them for it. That response is in you, that feeling is in you of anger. They took something from you, your pride or your money or your well-being, and made you vulnerable. Or people become your enemy because they are a part of group of a people that your people feel have been hurt by them. And you take on that identity. Those people are always doing that. In Blumenfeld's case, it was both. A terrorist personally shot her father, and the terrorist was a Palestinian, and she and her father were American Jews. The hate between the groups of people, between Jews and Palestinians, goes back ages. Laura was at first consumed with hate, the reaction. What happened to her father confirmed all the stereotypes that Israeli Jews have about Palestinians. Jesus didn't say, like your enemies. Liking has to do with our feelings, right? Sometimes we just like people immediately. We just have this intuitive, emotional response to them, connection with them. Liking is about our feelings. Jesus' command to love our enemies is not about our feelings. It's about our actions. We often use the term love as our feelings. Going back to like, we like our friends. We like our classmates in school, or like people in our neighborhood, people we interact with. We like them. And if we like them really a lot, we say we love them. Right? We like our friends. We love our spouses, our partners, our children, our parents, our best friends. Love in that way is just like multiplied. We think love is about multiplying like. It's about our feelings. When we read the Gospels, we don't see Jesus talking about love as feeling. Jesus talks about love as actions that we do, loving actions that we do. So in the story of the prodigal son, the father forgives his wasteful prodigal son. Now, I'm sure the father also felt love about him, but Jesus didn't talk about that. He talked about what he did. He didn't talk about the warm feelings he had for his son. He talked about how the father forgave him and welcomed him back home and threw a big party and said, this is how we welcome people into our home. And he talked to his older son, who was not having the warm, comfy feelings his dad was having, right? It was all about actions, about loving actions, not about the feelings. In the story of the Good Samaritan, he talks about how the Good Samaritan helped the Jewish man on the side of the road who was left for dead. how he loved him, not because of his feelings. In fact, since he was a Samaritan and this man was undoubtedly a Jew, he probably didn't have warm feelings for him. But he took pity on him when he saw he was injured. And he did loving things to him. He gave him first aid. He gave him transportation to a safe town. He even paid the innkeeper to take care of him while he went on in his business ventures with the promise he would return. All those are about actions. Look at the Gospels where Jesus talks about love. It's always about actions. He never talks about our feelings. So loving your enemies is not about how you feel about them. It's about what you're going to do in interacting with them. Laura Blumenfeld hated feeling hate more than she hated the man who shot her father. So she decided to find out about him. Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, named one of those habits as seek first to understand, then to be understood. To love your enemies, you have to start working at understanding them, to walk in their shoes, to try to see the world from their perspective. Why did your enemy hurt you? Why do they hurt you? Do you know enough about them to get a sense of what happened? Several years ago in Charlotte, the churches that were part of Mecklenburg Ministries, which is an interfaith group in Charlotte, started a citywide venture in which we encourage people to sit down for lunch or for tea or for coffee with people who are different from you, racially, ethnically, income level, political affiliation, religious affiliation, and just have lunch a few times and talk about your life. Try to understand the person. Some of the testimonials that came out of that were amazing. We even had some city officials and leaders to join in the initiative. Sitting and listening and trying to understand your enemy, or if you don't want to call him an enemy, just somebody who's different from you, opens your eyes to a different world. Blumenfeld is a journalist, and to find out about the man who shot her father, she put on her journalist hat, and she went undercover. She worked on a story about Palestinian and Israeli conflict without revealing her personal involvement in this story. She traveled to the West Bank and she interviewed the family of the man who had shot her father, and eventually met him in prison and spoke to him. Now, let me just first say, that was risky business. That story could have ended in a way different way than it did. And so let me say to you, first of all, in terms of trying to love people, your enemies, people who have hurt you, you first of all need to be safe. I'm not going to ask anybody who's been abused by a partner or by a parent or by a bully that you should put yourself in harm's way again. Let me just say that quite clearly out front. Don't put yourself in an unsafe position. Don't let an abusive person hurt you again. But from a safe place, is there some ways in which you can find things out? Blumenfeld's undercover work worked. Over the series of months when she interviewed this family and finally the person who shot her father in prison, she found out about the plight of Palestinians in ways that she had never heard before. She knew all about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the Jewish perspective. That's all she had heard all of her life. And now she heard it up front and in person from people who were in the midst of that from the other side. And it took on a whole different perspective for her. As she came to understand their situation, her feelings softened. The terrorist's family became more human, less enemy. When she finally revealed to them that she was the daughter of the man who had shot her father as an act of terrorism, his family were so overwhelmed with remorse and shame that this person of good conscience, of good character, had been so devastatingly impacted by this event. While Jesus told us to love our enemies, the examples he gave in our reading today are also ways of lovingly resisting our enemies, not letting our enemies use us as a doormat. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other also. If someone takes your coat, take off your shirt and the rest of your clothes if necessary, and be naked to shame them what they're doing. In Matthew's version, he even said, if someone forces you to go a mile, you go a second mile. Each of these phrases are examples of resisting the enemy, but in loving, nonviolent ways. The second mile example is exactly in Jesus' context. The Roman soldiers were able, if they were traveling across a territory, if they could force a person to carry their pack for 1 mile. That was Roman law. They were allowed to do that. Didn't care what you were doing. But that was it, just 1 mile. Jesus encouraged his listeners to be their own people. You might force me to do this, but I'm a free person. I'm going to give you a second mile to show you that your oppression is not going to beat me down. I'm going to be loving to you, but loving to you in a way that says, I'm my own person, and what you're doing to me will not defeat me. Likewise, the turning the other cheek is also forcing the person to look at what they're doing. Giving them their shirt off your back, being partially naked, is also a shaming device. It's not violent, it's not fighting back, it's not hitting back, but it's saying, I'm my own person, and I'm saying, you are not going to defeat me. Now, are you going to see me as a human? And can we see each other as humans? And break this cycle of violence and fighting back and resisting. These passages, these words of Jesus in this part of Luke and in Matthew are the types of ideas that Mahatma Gandhi used to create the nonviolent movement in resistance to British occupation of India. And that later, Martin Luther King, who went to India to meet Gandhi, used in the nonviolent civil rights movement in our own country. Loving our enemies doesn't mean that we become doormats. It means that we work to understand them. It means that we refuse to lose our dignity when they oppress or try to hurt us. And we want to see their humanity, and we want them to see our humanity and to understand us as well as we're understanding them. Laura Blumenfeld's story began with trying to get revenge for her father. It ended with her family and the terrorist family becoming friends and transforming one piece of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. May we be so blessed